All right, so we are live on Facebook with Milagros Phillips and our guest tonight, uh, Kayla Gebeck. Um, Welcome, Kayla. We're so happy to have you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Doctrine of Discovery on Indigenous Peoples Day, which is a little-known doctrine from the 1400s, which has a huge impact on our legal systems, on land use in the United States, and in Indigenous communities across the world, actually. We're so excited to have Kayla Gebeck. I should say Kayla Gebeck Carroll, recently married. Kayla is a member of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians and a senior public affairs advisor for Holland and Knight in Washington, D.C., where she develops federal advocacy strategies and provides policy representation for tribal governments, Alaska Native corporations, and their enterprises on legislative and regulatory matters, all with the goal of promoting the health and economic well-being of tribal communities. So Milagros, I know that you've been really interested in the Doctrine of Discovery recently and how it connects to all of your teachings on the history of race and racism and the caste system. So this is going to be a great conversation. So just to toss out an initial question and get you all going, Kayla, what is the Doctrine of Discovery and why does it matter today?
Great question. So the Doctrine of Discovery has been around, as you mentioned, for a very long time. Pope Alexander VI actually used the Doctrine of Discovery to support control over lands that were allegedly discovered by Christian explorers when they were going out into the world. This includes explorers like Christopher Columbus, even if they got lost at sea and ended up somewhere where they weren't meant to be. But it gave them authority to essentially claim and take ownership and control of it. It's very much infiltrated indigenous communities around the world. In the United States, it's been particularly impacting tribal communities since 1824, when Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in a court case, it's Johnson v. McIntosh, that tribal lands were essentially inalienable. So there was a dispute between a few tribes, two tribes, who had sold their lands to non-natives. And the federal government, unhappy with its relationship with these tribal governments at the time, came in and said that these sales were invalid and that the tribal governments only had authority to sell their lands directly to the federal government itself. It was really important and critical case because in it, they used the characteristic of natives being savages whose only occupation was war and traditional subsistence to basically undermine their inability to own land as the federal government sought it. And so it was essentially undermining their own ability to be able to take control, to sell their own lands, to make decisions that impact their communities on lands that they had been residing on for time immemorial. The Supreme Court's continued to recognize this doctrine, even most recent case in 2005. It was the City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, where it was majority ruling led by our former Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who basically said, under the Doctrine of Discovery, title or ownership of the land was occupied by Indians when the colonists came, but were reserved by the right of the sovereign. So throughout time, this doctrine has continued to undermine Native Americans' ability to fully own and control the lands that they currently live on.
So this doctrine was actually started by Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about specifically what that doctrine says, because in the work that I do a lot of context work. So giving people context for the experiences that we're having with race today and race and racism. And it's important for people to understand history, because a lot of people say, well, that happened a long time ago. Why do we even need to know about it? So often people miss the fact that once something has been institutionalized or turned into law, it then exists in a book. Mm-hmm. That book is something that 1,000 years from now, a lawyer can pick up that book and go, it's right here, it's law. right? And it doesn't matter if it's just or unjust. If the laws don't get rescinded, they're still literally in the books and can be used at any time. So let's talk specifically about what that law said, what Pope Alexander said, that made this something that could stand through ages and time.
Yeah, so I don't have the doctrine pull up in front of me, so I can't quote it exactly, but in some, it basically said that, you know, we are, as the explorers, as the colonizers, we are going out and we're exploring lands that where no one else exists. They're terra nullius, incapable of ownership by anyone else but us. Unfortunately, in practice, when the settlers got to these areas and realized that people were there, the doctrine further evolved and morphed into undermining the basic human existence of these people and their ability to own this land. So like in Australia, it's very common. There's a big case, Mabo, where they said terra nullius, this land was barren. There was no one here. There was no form of society. There were no governing systems. There were no people capable of owning land in a way that the explorers sought. So it completely gave power to a group of people, even if there were no, I mean, even if these systems, complex systems of living in society existed, completely undermined that and told them that they didn't exist at all. It was a barren land, and it was their ability to take that over.
My understanding also from reading it is that that law also allowed for people to be enslaved because they were non-Christian, so they were considered savages. And so everywhere that natives lived, where Europeans went over to take over the land, they had, you know, this law also gave them the right to enslave people. And to basically institutionalize whatever served them, which again, it's you know, understanding that these things may have happened a long time ago, but they still affect us today. And if we don't understand the history, we keep repeating it over and over and over again, and we don't, you know, we don't ever move out of it. And also the reality that after Columbus went back to Spain with, he took with him about approximately 100 Tainos, is what we know, to prove that he had made it to India, right? Along with gold and silver and all the things that he found on those islands. And so word spread very quickly once he got back to Europe about in 1493 about what he had found, and the doctrine came out of that, is my understanding. So when they saw all this gold and all this silver, and the other thing is that this law still exists it's in the Vatican, and also you know, that people need to understand that it wasn't just for Spain. That was something that, because so many European countries, and remember, they were all related, like all the monarchies were related, right? So very quickly the word spread. And so everybody, you know, just started showing up in these lands that had millions of natives living in them in the Caribbean, North, Central, and South America. And so having this law that basically said it applied to your heirs, successors, and I forget what the third one was, but basically everyone and anyone who was birthed from a European womb, basically, that, you know, and a marriage and so on and so forth. So yeah, so talk to us a little bit about the psychological and emotional impact of that law on the Native people.
Yeah, I think it's had a lot of impacts. I mean, when the doctrine was used to undermine, and as you can see throughout the cases in which it's been referenced in the United States specifically, it undermines the character and religion of certain peoples. It basically says, you're not capable of these certain attributes, therefore you're not capable of ownership. Because you live in subsistence, because you're a savage, you are less than, you are not equal to, and therefore you do not have the same power that we have. And translating that in, I think it's caused a lot of psychological impacts and spiritual impacts on communities, feeling of inferiority, not being able to control all the decisions that are made for your community, that are made about your land. How can you protect your children? How can you protect your wives, your sisters, your brothers, your grandparents? You are not capable of having full agency over your own decisions and control. And when you're constantly told that, and that's beaten into you both verbally, the way you're treated, and in the law, and your status of ownership, your ability to own land, that just contributes to this feeling that you're inadequate. And unfortunately, there are high rates of suicide, depression, mental illness, substance abuse that I think has come out as a result of this, because the spirit feels that it's not capable, it is inadequate. And so it's very important that we have these conversations so that we can kind of reinvigorate that your spirit is important. It was misrecognized. Your characteristics were misrecognized. Somebody assigned things to you that are not true. Your culture is beautiful. Your diversity is beautiful. The way you look at the world is beautiful. But unfortunately, we're battling what the law continues to be today and how the law continues to impact Indigenous people around the world, their ability to build strong communities, to build this pride and strength.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what do you think would happen if this law were overturned?
If it were overturned, it would be a beautiful thing. It would empower a lot of Indigenous communities to kind of feel that, a recognition that everything they thought, all of these feelings of, that you're incapable, that you're unworthy, they would be recognized, and that we've lied to you. We've made you feel inadequate. I chuckled a little bit because it's hard for me to believe that a government that has used it for so long, and this is especially me working in a legal field where precedent matters, it's hard to admit that you've been wrong when you've used it for centuries to belittle people. But it would be an empowering thing. And I think the more people that begin to understand it and its implications on communities can also start to work with these communities to really find their strength and agency again.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always remind people that we are a country of laws. Laws do not always equate to justice. Justice is about balance. And we need to start looking at the world from the eyes of what is it that we really want? Do we really want justice? Because justice requires equity, which is not equality, right? And it requires a whole new different set of strategies. So, being able to remind people of who they really are.
Mm-hmm.
And how extraordinary it is that you get to be on this planet for X amount of years, right? None of us really knows exactly how long. But while you're here, what are you going to do to make a difference? What are you going to do to leave the next generation a more just just more just world, more equitable world? And so we need to start looking at these things, and we need to be able to tell the truth about it.
Mm-hmm.
I always remind people that racism may not be your fault, but it is still our collective responsibility to do something about it, to transform it, to make a difference. Yeah. So what would be your deepest desire when it comes to, particularly around this law?
I think I kind of alluded to it before, but giving Indigenous peoples full agency to determine, their futures. I mentioned Johnson v. McIntosh. It made tribal lands inalienable, and the justification was the Doctrine of Discovery, that they were unable or incapable of understanding or owning land in the same way. But the implications that has is that tribal communities don't have full agencies to develop their communities without permission or without approval of the federal government to build critical resources, economic development opportunities that could strongly benefit their communities, that could heal their communities. We're always having to go and ask for permission. We're always having to go and ask for, approval to get a permit or different things. Congress has implemented laws recently to try to streamline this process, But you know, it's been decades since Johnson v. McIntosh, and we're still working with Congress to try to break these barriers down. But if tribes just had agency, they wouldn't need to go ask for help to make their communities healthy, to build basic infrastructure that they need and every basic human needs to thrive in this world. So for me, my dream would be, you know, with this document or doctrine and recognizing it, that we give that agency back to communities so that they're in the driver's seat on how they need to heal and what they need to do to get there.
I have just one more quick question for you as we come to the end of our program, and that is about the role of the Vatican when it comes to this law. What would you say about that?
You know, I think it would be an important first step. It did stem from them and everything that they've done, but I don't think it would be enough because it's so enshrined in our legal systems. I referred to a court case earlier, Mabo v. Queensland. It was, there were several cases, but the ruling in 1992 by Justice Brennan was really important because, you know, it basically said that if we were to overturn the Doctrine of Discovery, if we were to admit that Australia was not terra nullius, it wasn't empty when we arrived, it would fracture the skeleton of the legal skeleton of Australia. We would cease to exist. And unfortunately, I think that's something that continues to hold back legal systems from recognizing this principle. So while I think it's an important first step, I think there'd be a lot of work in each country that has indigenous people that's implemented and embedded and institutionalized this doctrine into their systems, that we would have to continue to break down these barriers and reestablish this agency.
Kayla, I can't thank you enough for coming and speaking to us about this very, very important piece of history that is still affecting us today. Thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you're currently doing. You're making a big difference. Everyone needs to know about this. It's important to all of us. It's part of our collective international history and is still affecting us today. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you for having me.